So we early on did some research around where do people expect to hear about clinical trials and what are the barriers for them to participate. The way Evrima works is we would see the protocol, understand what's programmable, build that software code, and rather than them having to manually troll through records, they can just click that button and engage.
Hey guys, it's Charles Beasley and welcome to Good Clinical, a podcast and YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing the future of medicine and human health. On today's episode, we have Charlotte Bradshaw. Charlotte is the founder and CEO of Evrima, a company dedicated to raising awareness about clinical trials and ensuring that patients are aware of the opportunities to participate in clinical trials and that doctors can also get their patients onto clinical trial as well, which is a fantastic endeavor and one to be lauded. So Charlotte, welcome to Good Clinical. Great to have you today.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
I have to say, this is quite a new experience for me. I think we mentioned before we got rolling that this is the first international guest and the first remote podcast we're doing at Good Clinical. So it's all guns blazing. Very excited to have you.
Very privileged to be the first international guest on your podcast.
Yeah, the first international guinea pig. We'll see how we go. But yeah, thank you so much. All right, let's get stuck into it. So clinical trials. What is your background and what do we need to understand about maybe your past experiences that led you to start Evrima?
Yeah, great question, Charles. I did not plan to have a clinical research career. I didn't know there were career options that would suit my skill set and background, and kind of fell into the industry, which I think is quite common for a lot of other folks I've spoken to. I studied an art science degree in Australia and then went into market research. And I loved being a project manager in market research. I got exposure very quickly to executives to really understand what makes or breaks products or services within a whole bunch of different markets. So that was really exciting. I had that curiosity to really understand what is working in the market. And from that, I got an opportunity to work in a phase 1 unit and transfer those skills into clinical research instead of market research. So that was really exciting. That was my big break, so to speak. And that organization at the time was effectively a startup itself. So I was fortunate to be given the remit to really steer the recruitment and marketing of that organization from the ground up. And that's really where I saw the first challenge of how do we find participants for clinical trials quickly, give them a great experience? How do we make the whole process efficient?
Yeah. It's quite interesting you mentioned that you fell into clinical research to begin with, because I think that is a bit of a cliche, right? It's more often than not people don't know about a clinical trials or a clinical research career, and they've got some science interest, some background in medicine or pharmacology or just biomed, and they just happen upon, clinical trials are a thing in this part of the world. I thought that was just out of some, lofty university or college in the United States, for example. But no, it's everywhere. I could completely relate to that because I fully fell in as well. I did my 5 years at uni, and then all of a sudden, what do I do with this? Let's find a job, and lo and behold, fell into clinical trials. That's interesting that you noticed or you found parallels in your market research career and noticed the pain points of finding patients for clinical trials. So that was like your eureka moment of going, this is a problem that we have. We've got a service, clinical trial. The problem is it's difficult to find patients or difficult for people to be even aware of a clinical trial ongoing. Let's have a bespoke solution for that problem.
Yeah, and maybe just to caveat that piece, it wasn't for many years until I started Evrima. In fact, I thought, someone will come in, sweep the market, there'll be an amazing solution, everyone will be happy. And I think that was very naive because we're in a very complex and complicated and highly regulated industry. So when you mix that with innovation, things can be tricky. So it was for many years that I sort of sat on the ideas, and not until 2019 that I founded Evrima. Mm-hmm. The problems that I saw firsthand, I quickly realized weren't just what I was experiencing. This was a global issue. So many sites were facing challenges and doctors just did not have access at their fingertips of what clinical trials could be available for their patients. So it's a really manual process. It's highly unpredictable, really stressful, and sometimes you're not given the budget that you need in order to find those potential participants. So it was, how do we attack all of those different problems and find solutions?
Yeah. So what's the traditional approach? Is it literally picking up the phone or putting flyers throughout hospitals? What is the
Yeah,
standard
I mean, I think
classical?
I have fond memories of my experience firsthand, which was definitely flyers, lots of print media, like traditional mass media was, and it's still very popular now. We still run campaigns in both digital and print media, but it's not our main focus. So I think that the challenge, particularly for clinical trial sites, is they're not a marketing agency. They shouldn't be expected to be a marketing agency. They're not going out to buy millions of dollars worth of advertising like a car or a telco or an energy provider. So we've got this disconnect with what sponsors and the industry expect, particularly of clinicians and trial sites, and the reality of, these people have done their degrees, their clinical degrees, that's their expertise, but they're now being asked to be marketers. So we're really unraveling and aiming to support particularly those clinicians with their outreach and awareness.
Yeah. Because, I mean, if you don't have patients, then you don't have a clinical trial, right?
Exactly
And
right.
then you don't have the drug at the other end approved in patients globally or regionally. Yeah.
Exactly
Yeah.
right.
So instead of going down the mass marketing flyers, so what are the range of products that you're offering here to solve that problem of raising awareness of clinical trials and getting patients onto a clinical trial?
So we early on did some research, and we've very recently, in fact this week, released the updated research around where do people expect to hear about clinical trials and what are the barriers for them to participate. Now, the research shows again and again that people expect to hear about it from their trusted healthcare providers, such as GPs, pharmacies, allied health specialists. But that's not necessarily happening at scale. Like, it's not embedded in clinical practice, standard clinical practice. So we know that that's where people want to go. That's where they're hoping to get information, but it's not happening. There's a huge divide between clinical research and general practice, for example. And that's what we need to solve for. We need to have those conversations around awareness. Doesn't mean that people will participate, but they need to know and understand that they've got some options potentially. So the way I kind of view how Evrima works in this space is we're building networks of clinicians across GPs and the pharmacy space to enable those healthcare providers to access trial information and provide that to their cohorts or their communities, their patients. Now, that's a really big task, because one of the problems that we're trying to solve here is, how do we identify eligible people for various different protocols? And often that comes down to clinical data, not whether the person feels like they might be suitable or whether they're motivated to take part, but actually were they clinically diagnosed with, the primary condition, which means that it's about how do you integrate into systems that hold that data and provide that trial information for those GPs or pharmacists. And that's what Evrima's done.
Amazing. I mean, yes, so many moving parts there. That was a bit of must have been a Herculean effort to bring all those stakeholders together. Because, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that GPs are just waiting to have more things thrown on their plate. More things to consider. You have to
You're
make
right.
it easy for them to access, to add it to their list of things that they need to get through in a day, right?
Exactly right. And the research that we found speaking to GPs was, don't change our workflow, don't make us go outside of our existing practice management system, make it as easy as possible. So we've taken that feedback on, built a system that integrates into their day-to-day workflow so that it is really easy for them. And we're still taking on that feedback, and it's really important that we're effectively co-designing these products.
Yeah, that's amazing. So when you say it's integrated, do they get a flag that, if they've got a patient with XY disease, there are open clinical trials within the general area
Exactly.
kind of thing? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
amazing.
So
Yeah.
it's what we call it, from a technical perspective, we call it a digital phenotype. So
Mhm.
the way Evrima works is we would see the protocol, understand what's programmable in the inclusion exclusion criteria, build that software code, push that out to the GP networks, and rather than them having to manually troll through
Yeah,
records, they can just click that button, see which patients meet that criteria, and engage in the way that makes sense to them.
that's incredible. So it's really putting it front and center in everyday clinical practice for these GPs. They've got a patient coming in who might be freshly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or something else, and then there's a trial out there that's recruiting. Incredible. So what kind of things can you include in that digital phenotype? Is it just primary diagnosis, or is it like lab results as well? Or
So it depends on which data set you would be integrating to, but the things for us that we focus mostly on are around clinical diagnosis, reason for visit, and we want to exclude a lot of things as well. So some of the things that you might see in a protocol as standard would be, for example, women are not pregnant or planning to become pregnant, or there might be some particular conditions that need to be excluded per protocol. So we would build all of those up. Things like blood pressure range, have they had recent bloods? Are we looking at ALTs, for example?
Mhm.
So there's a plethora of information, but it does vary trial by trial.
Yeah, that's incredible, because I can imagine, what I've seen in my career is that you might have, say, an EPR website. This is, very blunt tools, mass media marketing in the digital age, and you've got maybe the top 5 inclusion and exclusion criterion listed, but that might not make absolute sense to a patient who's just trolling through the internet. And then they
Exactly.
go, oh, yeah, I've got that primary diagnosis, but there's all these other things that they also have to meet or not meet to then qualify. So then they get all excited about a clinical trial, they go inquire about it, and then they're let down because, your pre-screen failed on a whole bunch of other criteria that you're not aware of. So having a GP involved in that early stage must make the attrition much lower, but also the success of getting onto a trial that much more appealing or
Yeah,
possible.
it's definitely a good point that you raised there, Charles, in terms of what's that conversion rate from these different channels, from pharmacy, GP, direct to
Mm.
patient. We're at the moment running these pilots across various different studies in various different locations. So hoping that by the end of the year we can release some of that data and show um, whether we're onto something that is a lot more scalable because you've got that trusted healthcare provider there answering those Q&As early on.
Yeah. So what would be your vision for how you would want to see Evrima and these technologies and these solutions? What influence would you like to have or hope to see?
Well, that's a big question, Charles. um, for me, what's really important is that we actually have an impact. I think there are so many options to help solve the clinical trial value chain. So we think about it takes 8 to 10 years, if not longer, to get a drug to market or a device to market. Um, I'm really closely tied to solving those problems all the way along. So rather than us focusing very deeply in one link of that chain, we want to be able to solve end to end. And so for us, what's important is that we can actually monitor and measure the impact that we're having. How many trials can we contribute to? How many sites can we build relationships with? Beyond the Australian and New Zealand shores, can we bring more of that research and create more jobs that maybe weren't specifically available a few years ago because of the way that we're innovating in the space? But ultimately, it's very much tied to enabling that research to happen faster, more cost effectively, and then ultimately getting those treatments to the people that need them. I think day to day we're talking to these participants and they've got this high unmet need when it comes to dermatitis, or we've got lots of dry eye studies at the moment. People are looking for options. So we are really tied to how do we actually help these people on their clinical journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the argument, looking at it objectively, the argument for participating in a clinical trial is quite compelling, but there's so much friction in the way to get someone actually on a clinical trial, right? And if you can address that friction, make it a bit more slippery, a bit more easier, then yeah, I think it's like great for everyone. It's great for the industry. It's great for the people conducting the research. It's great for the patients on the trial. It's great for the end user eventually. Yeah, I think it's super, super compelling. I mean, I've constantly on this podcast, I'm like railing about how disappointing access to new medicines are. For example, in New Zealand, it takes a very long time for things to get approved or funded. So your access through the public health system to like modern medicines is gradually waning. And I see clinical trials kind of plugging the gap, at least in the short term, maybe in the long term as well, should the funding issue not really go away. And technologies like Evrima are going to be pivotal to make that possible, right? Because if everyone's running a clinical trial but you don't have any patients, then you don't have a clinical trial
Yeah,
at
exactly.
all.
I
Yeah.
think just to add to what you were saying, Charles, about the broader, the bigger piece there on the healthcare system, clinical trials actually have a chance to take some of that pressure off the healthcare system as well, right? Because if you're referring a participant to a trial instead of the standard of care, they're still going to get access to that specialist or for example, a rheumatologist. They're still going to get great care as part of that clinical trial. And perhaps that can take some of that pressure off the standard healthcare system. So I completely agree. I think we've got a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think New Zealand and Australia, we're both becoming quite strong players in the early phase clinical research.
Yes.
You don't have to do a study under a IND, for example. We kind of don't really care what the US FDA have to say, unlike some other countries that would always defer to whatever the US FDA have said when they review a clinical trial. So it's really compelling because we've got huge opportunity to participate. And like you say, a huge opportunity for trials to pick up the slack in the system or be involved in everyday healthcare, essentially. So people need to be more familiar with the concept of a clinical trial, more comfortable with the concept of a clinical trial, because when you hear when someone, if you're not like well versed, initiated in the terminology, it sounds pretty daunting, right? It's like you probably have this picture in your mind, like silent corridors, top security lab, white gowns. Whereas it's really quite boring most of the time, right? A clinical trial. So it's like it's not space age, it's not science fiction or anything.
No, it's definitely not from the Marvel universe, and I think there are a lot of Hollywood blockbuster movies out there that would shine a negative light on clinical research, and ethics goes out the door in that Hollywood setting. But you're right. I think clinical research it's so important and it's run at such a high standard. It's higher than the average healthcare as well, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
because of regulatory standards. So people that participate are getting such good experience and access to care. It's just a different way of thinking about it.
yeah. So have you thought about any avenues that you could take Evrema in just the wider awareness of clinical trials, maybe not through GP or pharmacy practice, just so people are more comfortable with the concept, so when they do get approached by a
Yeah,
HCP
exactly.
or
Yep.
another area? Yep.
So, really, the goal is how do we get trials into day to day and how do we access full patient population? So, the population of Australia is really the goal. How do we get conversations happening from top down and grassroots up? So, there's a lot of work to be done there. Evrima is trying across the board from direct to participant, but also with those healthcare providers. So it's really important that I think we consider what those governments in New Zealand and Australia are doing to support this at a countrywide, regional perspective. We need to think about continuing to be competitive in this market. A lot of research could potentially go to other regions or other countries if we don't present that in a united, competitive, and attractive way, which I think we do. The other thing is really socializing and reducing any kind of misconceptions or taboo in the communities. So one thing that's going to be important that I don't think we've, as countries or regional sectors, have we done a lot of, is that diversity piece. So how do we do more of that and get into communities, but making sure that we are tailoring those conversations and that information in a way that makes sense for those specific communities. I think we'll start to see a lot more of that coming through in years to come.
Interesting. Yeah, I spoke with an early phase clinical director of a early phase unit, and he mentioned that they're starting to see a lot of diversity plans coming through in a clinical trial. Actually front loading, if that's the right phrase. Always, when I say that, it always reminds me of a washing machine. But front loading the requirement to have a more diverse population in your clinical trial, even as early phase, phase 1 or 2A, for example, which I thought was quite interesting and makes sense, because you don't want everyone with the same experience, with the same ethnic background or racial background in your trial, because that's not representative of the wider population.
Exactly. And we'll start to see this. I'm really encouraged that you're starting to see this and hear about it from an early phase perspective. And hopefully we start to see a lot more of this. But we know that it's front and center from the FDA, and that we would expect to see requests for diversity plans right through from first in human phase up to phase 3, and probably post-marketing as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. So to round up the discussion of what Evrima is all about, are there any other aspects that are really pivotal to what you're doing?
The way that Evrima's divided or split up is we've got 2 products, so Evrilink and EvriPath, and then we have our services, which is project management, marketing and advertising, and account management, which is evriquest. So the 2 products, I'll talk about those first. EvriPath is our referral network, and that's where we have that integration and access to patient reach that you wouldn't traditionally have. So we're really focused on working with sites and CROs and sponsors to enable their trials to get into the hands of pharmacists and GPs. Then our other product is EvriLink, and that's a recruitment platform which allows sites to receive their referrals securely with all the information about the participant that's been verified and vetted for their particular study. It also gives insights and reporting in real time to the sponsor and the CRO. So we built that off the back of the feedback and the first-hand experience of particularly study teams running around trying to update things all the time in spreadsheets, sticky notes, pieces of paper, phone calls. So it was really built from the feedback that we had from people running clinical trials, whether it's from a site perspective or CRO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gosh, it's given me flashbacks and PTSD hearing about populating spreadsheets and trying to keep them update. As a project manager in a clinical trial space, it's just a nightmare.
It is a nightmare.
And there's so many moving parts, and if you're trying to coordinate, this is the weird thing about clinical trials, right? Like the technology we use on one end is incredibly modern and brand new and early phase, first in man trials. Like the science is brand new, but some of the technologies we're still using are so old. Like so much of your day to day is in a spreadsheet.
Yes.
And then maybe in a CTMS as well, but then that just pushes out to a spreadsheet. So having these tools is like, well, why are we only adopting these things now? Why has it taken Charlotte to start Evrima to figure out how to do this? What do you think? Why do you think there was such a yeah?
Yeah, I think that topic in itself is probably an episode for your podcast because it really comes down to who's driving that technology adoption and usage. And, I feel so empathetic and sympathetic for the sites because oftentimes they're asked, use this because that's for this particular trial for this particular sponsor. And then you add that up and multiply it by 20, and all of a sudden you've got 20 to 25 e-thingies, as they call them. So I do think that it's complex. There's no silver bullet answer. It also varies between public healthcare systems who run research versus private, all of the security and the data management that's needed. So it's not an easy answer, but ultimately I think a lot more work needs to continue to happen around that user research and what are the solutions that the sponsor, the CRO, and the sites need, and how are they actually working now, and can we help them on that adoption of innovation and technology to make their lives easier.
Yeah, I've never worked at the site level, but I can only imagine when you've got, kind of jumping on what you've already said, 20 different studies, and they're all got these different platforms and modules and logins, and you're like, how am I supposed to manage this all? And you've got the sponsor saying, oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread.
It's definitely something that we hear a lot about in industry conferences. It's very topical. I don't think there is a silver bullet, but it means that we all need to collaborate together.
Yeah, for sure. So why don't we pivot to talk about your startup experience through starting Evrima? Because I think, that's part of the interest of this podcast as well. It's not just about, the new technology, but it's also how people have approached an entrepreneurial career. Because without people like yourself, we don't have new products, new services, new drugs, new technologies that are going to go and shape the world in the future. But in terms of starting and growing Evrima, what have been some pivotal challenges or pivotal decisions that you've had to make to grow the business to where it is today?
Great question. And I would say it's been 5 years, but really longer in terms of thinking about the business, how would it be structured, and the journey that we've been on. Some of the key forks in the road, or those inflection points were, quitting the corporate day job and going all in as opposed to a side hustle. I think in hindsight, if I'm brutally honest, I probably could have afforded 6 months more of the paychecks coming in regularly. So I would encourage people, if they're thinking about starting and going down that entrepreneurial pathway, to try and keep that going as much as possible while they've still got their day job, so to speak. The next inflection point for us was really around, well, what is that early product going to look like, and how do we get traction in the market? So what was really important for me back in 2019, 2020 was, let's make sure we're building something that adds value, and let's make sure that we can service those customers, get those case studies, and make sure that we're learning quite quickly. So revenue was really important very, very early on. We didn't take the grow at all costs sort of Silicon Valley playbook from the get-go. We certainly went into growth period in sort of 22, 23. And that was the third inflection point of, do we raise more capital and bring on new investors for that growth? What is that going to look like? And again, I'd say that's probably a whole podcast episode or several. But these are the kinds of big things that change or can potentially change the direction of the business, the strategy, and you've got to always come back to what's important, what are the values of the company, and are you doing things that are going to help you achieve that strategy and that mission and vision that you've set for the business.
Yeah, I can imagine that when you're starting something like this, there are so many things that you can do, that selecting the one to begin with, that is a really hard decision to make. And
yes,
choosing the things that you don't do is just as hard as choosing the things that you do. That makes sense.
It does make sense. And I actually remember distinctly a conversation with a female mentor who was a serial entrepreneur, and she'd said at that point, all paths lead to Rome. Just pick one. It might not be the right one in the end, but you've got to make a decision. Just make a call. And that's kind of stuck with me throughout the years. There's always a lot of pressure on founders and CEOs from various different angles. And sometimes you need to make that decision with the information that's available. And it might not be the perfect one, but it definitely helps you progress in achieving the goals that you've set.
Right. You just got to keep that plate spinning, keep the wheels turning.
Yeah, exactly
right.
You
don't want to sit in place and quibble about the right decision. Just make a decision and keep at it.
I always encourage the team to think about progress, not perfection.
Yes.
And I'm sure that there is someone attributed to this quote, but I forget who that is. And it's, perfection is the enemy of good. And I think these are the types of things that from an entrepreneurial mindset and a growth mindset you think about. it's not necessarily something that's natural for a lot of people.
Yeah, especially in maybe a sciencey background
Mm-hmm.
as well, right? Because if it's not perfect, then why would you do it? Like, why would you design a clinical trial or an experiment that wasn't the best that you could run it? Or so that makes sense in business perspective, but less so in like healthcare and medicine and science. So I can understand like having that switch. I mean, I personally had to kind of break my mind in that regard, going from my academic career into professional career, because a mentor of mine, a bit like what you just mentioned, he said, "Good enough is good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you stack up good enough times, as opposed to like perfection once or twice, you're
Exactly.
gonna have more wins on the board over
That's
time."
exactly right. And I guess
Yeah.
just to add to that, when you start a company, you know that there's a market out there. You know that you're going to have competition, and you've got to deliver. We're in a high stakes industry, so sometimes as a site or a CRO or a vendor like us, it's you're only as good as your last contract or your last deliverable. So it's really thinking about how do you maintain that and keep that stability and growth and not sacrifice it because it's not the perfect slide deck, for example, or it's not the perfect release or code. We've got to just keep that traction and that momentum going.
Yeah, definitely. When growing the business, did you maybe looking at more of a economics view of this? Did you raise capital, or did you take on debt, or did you get investors to raise the capital? How did you go about that piece? Because there's kind of two frames, or maybe three ways of doing it. One is you grow purely organically via the revenue that you generate and then reinvest it, which is safe, boring, not very quick. The other thing might be the other end of the spectrum is that Silicon Valley approach that you mentioned, which is raise a huge amount of money and then just go gangbusters from the get go and hope that you kind of break the system to your own design. But what approach have you taken with Evrima?
Yeah, we're somewhere in the middle. So
Yeah.
I bootstrapped early as a solo founder. It was about, right, let's get a contract, let's figure out where can we attract that early revenue. And then fortunate enough to go into an accelerator program that had pre-seed investment attached to it. So I started to get familiar with the investment community and the startup scene in Sydney, and then decided that, if we need to build a tech team, the revenue was not going to get us to where we wanted to be. So yes, let's go and raise capital.
Mm-hmm.
I think with that particular decision, a lot of people can go in different ways. Like you say, you can take on debt or you might mortgage your house. For me, the options were pretty limited. I didn't have a house. I had no assets to put and any capital to put into the business. And at that point, the revenue wasn't high enough to go to the bank like your traditional Westpacs, ANZs, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
it made sense for me to look at who are the investors in the startup scene at our stage that would help us on our growth journey. And that was a decision that made sense for Evrima. But I would definitely encourage people to consider all their options and really make sure that it makes sense to their business at that stage and where they want to go. They all have different, pros and cons and different ways of building that business.
Yeah, I remember speaking to a founder of a biotech company that use microbes to convert waste streams into usable fuels. So, like bioethanol and bio um, kerosene. So, like that, like avgas as well, which is quite amazing. Anyway, I asked him, if you do anything differently in your entrepreneurial journey, growing this company, what would it be? And without a second's hesitation, he mentioned that he would have not given up so much of his equity stake in his own company to raise money in the early days, because you've worked so hard on this idea and this concept, and you're starting to see traction and people are getting interested, and then you add up 5% here, 10% here, 15% there, and all of a sudden as your baby is no longer fully yours. Have you experienced that, like raising money and taking on debt and giving
I mean,
away? equity?
Yeah, you've got to really think about, you've got to do your modeling, you've got to put all your scenarios into a spreadsheet and work out what makes sense. Investors want to see that business succeed, obviously, but they also want to make sure that the founder and the founding team are wedded and locked into that business. So it doesn't really make sense for an investor to take a lion's share of it if the founders just say, oh, what's the point now? Because they're not going to get the outcomes that they want. I definitely think that, the reason to bring on venture capital is quite different to going to a bank and getting a loan. It really comes down to what is your vision and how big do you want to grow that business. Some people might just want a smaller business and then sell that in a short horizon and happy days. And that's fine. But I guess if you're looking at private equity or, the institutional investors and venture capital, there are some big numbers that they're looking at to return just based on that model, not the particular fund, but just how that works. So I guess it's helping early stage founders and entrepreneurs understand the mechanics. And that's definitely been something I've had to learn firsthand over the years of how all of that works.
Yeah. Were there any other big learning hurdles that you've had to make in pivoting to a entrepreneurial career? What has been like maybe the biggest breaking of one's mind experience that you've had?
Look, I think there's so many experiences that you're always on your toes. You're always looking at, well, what are the next 5 things that I need to think about? As a founding CEO, there are so many skills that you may not have in order to run a business successfully. So whether that's finance or people management, most entrepreneurs that I know are so passionate about the problem that they're trying to solve. And so for us, we've got to learn, okay, how do we bring that skill set of everything else to run a successful company? And that's where having, a support system, a great board, advisors, mentors, being able to hire and attract the right talent. I think sometimes there's an assumption that a founder is going to have all the answers. And the reality is we don't have all the answers. We need to learn quickly from people that have done it before. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've just got to learn quickly.
No, that's right. I've had similar responses on this podcast, especially because I think New Zealand's innovation ecosystem is probably not quite as mature as it is in Australia, by virtue of our size and population. But kind of what you're saying is, the people that have had previous success almost have like a duty to pass on those learnings and pass on that experience to the people that are coming through the ranks. So they don't have to necessarily go through, you're not going to go through the exact same problems and issues, but there are lessons that you can pass on to, give everyone a leg up. And it's almost like a chain of succession. When you go to a forest, and there might be like one little plant in a little oasis, and then over time you go back and then there's 3 different species there, and then over time there's 10, and so it's a bit like that. It's this ecosystem that is kind of self-fulfilling by virtue of its success, and it's like success passing it on. That person does the same, does the same, does the same. So I think the network effects cannot be understated, right? You can have a great idea, but without a good network behind you, supporting you, providing input, suggestions, and support, we won't have quite the same outcome.
Exactly. And it is a network effect. It's not about one individual. We're a team as a company of Evrima. We are one team, but then behind that team are so many support mechanisms and people. So I guess another analogy would be sports. You've got your players, but then you've got your coach, assistant coaches, you've got your sports scientists, you've got managers. There's so many other people that might not be, front and center on the screen, but they're there to make that team successful.
Yeah. And how has your role changed over time? So the company's 5 years old now, did you say? 2019, 2024. Obviously, the role as the founder and CEO in 2019 is very different to how it is now. But what does that look like over time?
Yeah, it definitely has evolved. I remember one of my advisors early on was saying, as the company evolves and matures, the CEO's role gets a little bit more boring. But I don't agree with that, because the opportunities that we have in front of us are really exciting. But of course, there are things like the financials, the capital raising plans, how do we bridge into new markets? How do we remain competitive? So there's a lot of strategic thinking that I would say is way more apparent now than the early days of, we need to think about that next customer, that next dollar. How do we afford to pay one salary? And now it's about, right, how do we want to approach this from a global perspective? How do we reach, hundreds of millions of people as opposed to a few hundred million people? Sorry, a few million people versus 100 million people.
Sure. How do we get Evrima into, like Donetsk or somewhere in the far reaches of Siberia?
Yeah. Who knows if there's trials out there, but I'm sure there will be.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. And what's more fun for you as a founder? Was it the early stage, getting it off the ground, like living on the edge, capital raise to capital raise, or however bootstrap to bootstrap, or is it now the bigger picture, expanding on those successes and getting it out to the wider world?
Yeah, I definitely think now is a really exciting time for the market as well. We're starting to see more open-mindedness around Australia and New Zealand doing late-stage trials. We're seeing more protocols that are unique in their design as opposed to the cookie-cutter, say, for example, SAD-MAD type trial for first-in-human. We're seeing a lot more of, well, we want to do the SAD-MAD, but we want to actually have a couple of cohorts of patients, and what does that look like? So from Evrima's perspective, we're really thinking about how do we innovate across the industry to help support the future of these types of trials? How do we partner with other maybe tech companies or healthcare companies to, again, grow that access to clinical trials? Something that's really important to us is thinking about studies that maybe don't need the traditional site bricks and mortar model. How can Evrima play in the hybrid or virtual space, and what does that look like? So I think it's also learning what's happening in the US and the UK and Europe, because often they've got that gap of maturity, and things generally were coming out of those markets and then filtering into Australia and New Zealand. So really keen to see what else comes from them in the next couple of years. So much to be done. So it's I would say more exciting than ever.
Yeah. So you don't think you're gonna make a quick sale and happy days, like that analogy you mentioned earlier?
So tied to the problem, Charles, that I think for me, it's more, I started the company to solve these recruitment challenges, and along the way we've uncovered that there are so many other challenges that actually Evrima could help solve for these as well. So still on that journey, still plenty to do. We'll have to catch up in a year's time.
Yeah, you'll probably have a whole bunch of other Evries in the pipeline to support the industry. Maybe I'll ask the same question that I asked that founder that I mentioned earlier. If looking back on the last 5 years and longer, because you mentioned that you'd been thinking about these problems for 5 years prior to starting the company, what, if anything, would you do differently?
Great question, Charles. Learn faster I know it sounds a bit vague, but again, it's if you can learn quickly and efficiently and apply that learning, then you're not necessarily going to make the mistakes that others may have made, or you can recognize and react faster. I think we saw the market change significantly over the last 18 months. We had that peak in 21, and then the market, we saw so many biotechs that weren't able to raise. So many things happened in that space. It's the benefit of hindsight now, but I guess if we could rewind the clock, it would be thinking about more of that sustainability and thinking about who are the sponsors and the CROs that we're working with now, and what can we do to support them in that period when the market does downturn. But there are so many things to learn with hindsight. So I probably wouldn't change anything drastically, but if we could have optimized a few things along the way, I'm sure that would have been helpful.
Definitely. And hindsight is 2020, right?
Exactly.
That's interesting about the market piece, because 2021, COVID, all that stimulus money was floating its way through the system, super low interest rates. People were trying to find ways of, getting somewhat better returns than 0.5%, if you're looking at the US in particular. So it was a weird time, wasn't it, for raising money for biotechs and companies like this. And then it all of a sudden kind of fell off a cliff, didn't it?
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
there was a lot
There
of
was all this
excitement.
exuberance and then suddenly none.
Yeah, exactly right. So I remember there was a US company that raised 200 million USD, first check, 200 mil. Since then, we haven't seen anything. And it's just incredible to see that kind of check size. Whereas in today's market, it would be incredibly different. The due diligence, the traction, the effort to get a check of that size would be a completely different conversation and strategy, I think, today than 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. It's probably a good thing, right? Because a lot of, there was a lot of really malinvestment during that period in like Bitcoin and cryptos and all these platforms and stuff. And a lot of VCs probably took a massive hit on the, how bad all that stuff was. To weed out the people making the bad decisions. Obviously a lot of money got wasted that could have been deployed elsewhere. But, probably does raise the quality when there's a bit more restraint
Yeah,
in money getting out there into the system, right?
I
Yeah.
agree.
To quality companies like Evrima. So maybe to finish up, what advice would you give to a budding entrepreneur in the clinical trials or biotech or health tech space?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone that's dabbling early stage, or maybe they've already set up a company and they're on that trajectory, I think having that support and that network is really, really important, because it is a roller coaster. It is, you're going to have some amazing highs and you're going to have some really, really low lows. And just having people to tap into, and whether it's a WhatsApp group or it's face-to-face networking events, being able to tap into people that have either already gone through that or are also going through that at the same time, I think is really helpful. It's not a standard, employee kind of typical corporate experience. So it's hard to expect, immediate family or your friend circle to understand that. And that's why I think having the balance of support from different areas is really, really important. Mental health is so important, and it's not an easy one. You always want to put your business first. You always want to put everything that goes into that business as number one. And I think I'm guilty of this, but so many founders just sacrifice their own not sense of self, but definitely mental health and self-care. And that's something that should be discussed as well. So I just encourage people to, reach out, and there's some great opportunities there, whether it's virtual or in person in various different cities.
Excellent. Well, great advice. To finish up, where can people go to find out more about yourself or Evrima?
So people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm definitely there and happy to have chats with anyone that's interested to further explore the entrepreneurial journey or clinical research in general. Evrima is online, evrima.com.au. All of our trials and products and services are there, and happy to have a conversation with anyone that's got questions.
Awesome. Well, Charlotte, this has been a really great, really inspiring story, and I love the work that you're doing. Again, making ensuring there's less friction to get people on clinical trial, which can only be a good thing. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Charles. It's been great to chat with you today.